Okay, so now we are going to go with chapter 16. Now, this is autonomic nervous system. So now remember, a lot of you guys are going to be heading on to AMP2. And so when you take a look at AMP2, what you're going to be doing is basically going from one core visceral system to another. And one of the common components of talking about each core visceral system is to talk about its regulation. And when you're talking about regulation, there are really two main systems that regulate the core visceral systems. The nervous system by way of the autonomic nervous system. So that's the main piece that will regulate the core visceral systems. And the other one is the endocrine system. And the two work together. And so if in order to understand how the core visceral systems are regulated and controlled as you go into AMP physiologically, you want to really get comfortable with the idea of how the autonomic nervous system works. And then eventually you'll get into AMP2 and they'll talk about the endocrine system, understanding how the endocrine system works along with it, because the two work in tandem with each other. So ultimately what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at the autonomic nervous system, which is essentially two divisions within that nervous system, the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. Those are the two primary divisions that we are going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and take a look at the ANS. First of all, the purpose of the ANS is essentially to maintain homeostasis, where that's constant internal conditions. And they are regulating all those involuntary visceral types of things in your body. For instance, they are in charge of your heart rate, your breathing rate, your body temperature, digestive processes, urinary functions. All those involuntary autonomic processes are under control of this piece of the nervous system. And so typically we refer, this is part of that motor division of the nervous system. There's actually two components to this. So the autonomic motor has kind of a cousin. You have what's called the somatic motor, which is typically focused on the skeletal muscles. So most of what we learned about in chapter 9 with neuromuscular junction and muscle control was somatic motor. But then you also have autonomic motor, which is in control of those unconscious involuntary muscle movements, like for instance, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and your glands. And so that's basically what how it kind of breaks down. It's what you're in control of and what you're not in control of, somatic versus autonomic. So we divide the ANS into two major divisions: your sympathetic division, which is your fight or flight division, and then your parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest division. Now, there is a subset of the autonomic that we refer to as the ENS, or the enteric nervous system. This is kind of like a subdivision of the parasympathetic. And it's in control of the digestive. And so that's usually, we usually cover that when we cover the digestive system. So that's something you'll take a look at later on. But basically, when you take a look at the somatic versus the autonomic, the important thing to understand is you're largely looking at peripheral nerves. They have both motor and sensory neurons in them, so they're mixed in nature. So a lot of these, in terms of the somatic, what they'll do is they'll basically innervate the skeletal muscles. And so that's what they're going to be going to. And then the autonomic will largely be focusing on innervating the smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. Now, the sensory neurons will basically have overlapping functions because they're kind of taking information from the same places. For instance, pain receptors is a good example. This is really the best example we have. So you have to have pain receptors going to both somatic and also autonomic, because both divisions have to know what's going on in terms of pain. And so if you take a look then at the two side by side, you can take a look at some of the overarching themes. For instance, the somatic nervous system, its skeletal muscle is your main effector, whereas an autonomic, it's smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. For regulation, it's basically mostly conscious and unconscious skeletal muscle movement. So your postural muscles, for instance, would be somatic nervous system, even though it's unconscious. And then in the autonomic, you're looking at regulation, right? That visceral regulation and mental functions, things like that. So your stimulus response, basically your skeletal muscles contracting in the somatic system. Usually your target tissues in the autonomic nervous system are either stimulated or inhibited to do whatever job it is they do. The arrangement of the neurons is basically kind of what we've been talking about for the last several chapters, right? You're going from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, you have an arrangement. Usually it's 2 neurons and 1 ganglion, right? So you basically will have 2 neurons in this system and generally a ganglion associated with these. And so what that does is it breaks these 2 neurons into what's called a postganglionic neuron and the other one into what's called a preganglionic neuron. And how it's organized is a little bit different between the 2 divisions. So, for instance, there's, I mean, these are other, I don't want to go through all of these because we'll talk more about these here in just a bit as we kind of go through these in context. It's a little easier to understand them. But this is a nice little table as you kind of work your way through the chapter to kind of come back and to sort of compare and contrast the differences between the somatic nervous system, which is mostly what we've been talking about for the last several chapters, versus the autonomic. And this kind of sets the stage for a couple of major differences, at least in terms of structure. But we want to kind of get into this a little bit so that we can start to tease apart and sort of dig deeper into more of the autonomic side of things and not spend so much time on the somatic, because that's most of what we've been talking about. So in the first top one, this is kind of your normal somatic hookup. For instance, you have your somatic motor neuron that's moving from the posterior, which means the anterior side. And it's going through the ventral root. The motor neuron is going out to the skeletal muscles, right? So that's your basic somatic hookup. And then the autonomic nervous system will oftentimes go from the lateral, typically the lateral horn, and it'll go through the ventral root as well because they're both motor. But in this case, what's going to happen is they are going to relay first through an autonomic ganglion, which is another processing station that will sort the message out. And then from here, it'll innervate different target tissues. For instance, we have smooth muscle in the intestines versus cardiac muscle versus the glands. And so this is the postganglionic neuron. So the preganglionic neuron is going from the spinal cord to the ganglion. And the postganglionic neuron is going from the ganglion to the target tissue. And that's the main difference between the autonomic nervous system. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the sympathetic division, the first division of the autonomic nervous system. So basically, when you take a look at this system, you're going to have preganglionic fibers that are coming off of the spinal cord. And then right next to it, lateral to it, and some of you guys saw this on the models, on those flat models, some of you saw this, is a chain of ganglia called the sympathetic chain ganglia. It's like a lateral series of ganglia that run parallel to the spinal cord. Now, what happens is as the preganglionic neuron moves through the ventral root and then into the spinal cord, it then interfaces and synapses in the ganglion, in the chain ganglia. So the preganglionic cell or fiber is very short. So That's, there you go. This one in the sympathetic division is short. So because the chain ganglia is basically right next to the spinal cord. However, then from here, then another neuron, the postganglionic neuron, will then go from the ganglia then to the target tissues. And in this particular case, the postganglionic neurons tend to be fairly long. And sometimes they will move into what's called collateral ganglia, which is extra ganglia aside from the chain ganglia, which is like an extra processing station. So it's like a substation, basically. You move from the spinal cord to the ganglia, you get processed, and you get moved to the collateral ganglia, you get processed again before you determine your final destination of where each postganglionic neuron will go. And so you have kind of different relay stations, if you will, in the sympathetic nervous system. Another thing that we want to sort of take a look at is the preganglionic axons, as they pass through the ventral roots, are going to go to a structure called the white ramus, right? The white rami communicants. And that's going to go to the sympathetic chain ganglia, or it'll go to the collateral ganglia, depending on which system or which hookup it has. Now, when we take a look at this, you can see the white ramus and the gray ramus. So this is kind of the connection as it's coming out of the spinal cord, going through the ventral root. These are looking at, focus now on the preganglionic axon that's basically coming out of the ventral root. So the first thing that's going to happen is the preganglionic axons will basically go through the ventral root, and then they will interact. So they'll kind of loop around. So there's a connection here, a ramus, like a little connection called the white ramus, that will basically take that into the chain ganglia. Now, from here, you can either interface and go through the gray ramus, or you can move up to another chain ganglia. So these are all interconnected with each other. And so ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to basically come through to the chain ganglia using your white ramus, and then it's going to go through the gray ramus, and then it's going to enter the spinal nerves out to the target tissue. So you have these two little conduits. It goes through the white ramus to the chain ganglia, then it goes out of the chain ganglia through the gray ramus, and then through the spinal nerve out to the target tissue. So this ramus system, white ramus and gray ramus, is there to kind of help you sort of, they're like off ramps, if you will, right? So the white ramus is kind of like an on ramp to the chain ganglia. And the gray ramus is like an off ramp. From the chain ganglia to the spinal nerve and out to the effectors, out to the effective tissue. So ultimately happens in the first step, what's going to happen is that spinal nerve is going to go through the ventral root, and then it's going to go through the ramus. And then once it is in the ramus itself, then these will exit the ganglia through the sympathetic nerve, which is going to be this guy right here. So this is step 2. So we didn't see this one up here. So we're kind of expanding this a little bit. So what's going to happen is when you have the sympathetic axons, they're going to come in through the white, and then they're going to synapse. And instead of going through the gray, they're going to basically cross over and then go through that postganglionic axon, which is your sympathetic nerve, and that's going to go out to the target tissue. So in the third step then, your collateral ganglia will basically pass through them without synapsing, right? So this is another form here. So you basically will go through the white ramus, and then it'll pass through. So notice this is the preganglionic axon that's passing through the white ramus, and then it's going to basically go through the chain ganglia, and then out through, in this case, the what's called the splanchnic nerve, and then that's going to basically hit a collateral ganglion instead of the chain ganglia, and then that'll go out to the viscera as your post-ganglionic. So this is how three different setups occur. So one is you're going through the gray ramus, right? So that's basically your presynaptic, or your preganglionic rather, is coming out the ventral root. It's going to be synapsing with your post-ganglionic axon, and that's going to go through the gray ramus and then out the spinal nerve, the post-ganglionic spinal nerve. That's one pathway. The second pathway is by going by way of the sympathetic nerve. So in this particular case, you have your preganglionic axon coming through the white ramus. It doesn't go through the gray ramus. In this case, it synapses with your postganglionic, which then goes out the sympathetic nerve to the target tissue. And the third pattern is the collateral ganglia, where the preganglionic nerve will pass all the way through, goes through the white ramus, goes through the chain ganglia, and then stops at a collateral ganglia before it hands it off to the postganglionic nerve, and that goes to the organ itself. Okay, so those are the first three patterns. And then there's one more pattern, however. In this particular case, this is going to the adrenal gland. So this is how you hook up a nervous hookup to the adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland is an endocrine gland, but it's also hooked up neurally. So in this particular case, you're going to have a preganglionic nerve that will go through the ventral root. It'll go through the white ramus, and then it'll go through the chain ganglia, or it'll basically descend like this, and then it'll interact with a collateral ganglion, where it'll directly synapse to the gland itself in the medulla, the adrenal medulla. So in this case, you don't have a post-ganglionic neuron, because your preganglionics are going directly into the cells of the medulla. So this is a neuroglandular synapse between the medulla of the adrenal glands and the preganglionic nerve. So those are four patterns of connection. And that's basically how your sympathetic is organized. Now, your parasympathetic is a little bit different. In your parasympathetic, there is no chain ganglia. So you don't have that parallel ganglia running parallel to it or next to it. Instead, what you have is either different nuclei or you'll have different ganglia kind of spread throughout, but it's not like a chain ganglia. And so this is kind of like what you have. First of all, a couple of things to understand is that in this particular case, the preganglionics are actually really long. Oftentimes, they'll be very long. The preganglionic neurons are long. And then the postganglionic neurons typically tend to be short. So it's just the opposite. So ultimately, like for instance, here you can see a couple of major hookups between the midbrain and some of the cranial nerves. So for instance, you'll have your pre-ganglionic neurons, which will then go to nuclei, which will then relay to your postganglionic, and that's going to be inside the brain. And then in the sacral region, you have the same sort of a thing. So you have these terminal ganglia that will shift from the preganglionic to the postganglionic neuron. Now, the important thing is that typically when you have the preganglionic axons going from the brain, when they pass the terminal ganglia through the cranial nerves, these are basically in close to the actual brain. So that's what causes these preganglionic axons to be short. And so generally speaking, because they're short, most of the transmission is in the postganglionic neuron. So that's basically going to be, vice versa. Because they're in close, that's the reason why the ganglionics will essentially be long, because sorry, I'm getting my wires crossed here with sympathetic. Most of the nuclei that shifts from preganglionic to postganglionic are basically shifted closer toward the effector organ in parasympathetic, which is what makes the preganglionic neurons long and the postganglionic short. That's the reason why it's reversed. In the sympathetic, what we had was that the ganglia, especially the chain ganglia, were in close, and that shortened those preganglionic neurons. And so in this case, it's a little bit different. Those ganglia, although they're still there, are all located in or near the organ, which creates these pre-ganglionic neurons to be long. Okay. And so this is basically what we have, kind of a comparison between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So for instance, the preganglionic, in this particular case, the location of the cell bodies are going to be in the lateral horns. And in the parasympathetic, they're typically brain stem and the lateral horns of the sacral region of the spinal cord and the gray matter. The CNS outflow, typically when you take a look at this, the spinal nerves, which are the postganglionic or the sympathetic nerves, is where they're going to be going through. Those are also postganglionic, and the splanchnic nerves, which are the preganglionic. Whereas in the parasympathetic, oftentimes it's the cranial nerves, these are the preganglionic, or the pelvic splanchnic. That's because of that sacral portion toward the end. The ganglia of these two is different, right? So for instance, the sympathetic chain ganglia is what really sets the sympathetic division apart. And they tend to be in there right next to the spinal cord, whereas the terminal ganglia are basically inside or near the organ itself. And that's a very different positioning of the ganglia themselves. The relative length. So the sympathetic is typified by short preganglionic and long postganglionic. And then the parasympathetic is typified by long preganglionic and short postganglionic. And that's mostly because of the positioning of the ganglia. The differential positioning of the ganglia is what causes that difference in short and long. And so when you take a look then at these structures, the way that these axons will interface with the organs, the way they infiltrate the organs is, in a couple of ways. First of all, obviously spinal nerves. So for instance, you will innervate sweat glands and smooth muscles and blood vessels and skeletal muscles and things like that, erector pili. So you basically use your spinal nerves to kind of infiltrate the actual tissue. Another thing you can also create is what's called the plexus, so which is essentially a network of nerves. And this will kind of create like a network of nerves that kind of innervates these same structures. You have both the head and neck plexus, you have a thoracic plexus, which is innervating the cardiac region, pulmonary, heart, and lungs, and things like that, and an abdominal pelvic plexus, which is going after the mesenteric, the gastric plexus, and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So these plexuses of neurons will kind of innervate and sort of spread themselves out throughout the body. Now, this is kind of a little bit more of how the sympathetic outflow works. It's kind of a bit of a better image than the last one we had, because the last one we had was not complete, and now this one is complete. And so you can see the difference, the very clear difference between the lengths of the pre versus post ganglionic and how it interfaces with everything. So here you can see in your spinal cord, this is your sympathetic division. So you can see how each of these preganglionic fibers are short and they go right to that chain ganglia. And then as they move out to the effectors, then they're going to be basically moving out to the areas of the body. And so you can see these long post-ganglionic nerves essentially going to all these different regions and interfacing with these different regions of the body, pretty much spreading the way all the way throughout. So there is sympathetic nervous connection to just about everywhere in your body. And in the case of the collaterals, then you can see that these will basically go straight to the collaterals, and then they'll kind of connect to some of, like in this case, you have the digestive organs and things like that. And so these are the major connections and the hookups. So you can see you have the major types of lumbar splanchnic nerves, lesser splanchnic nerve, the greater splanchnic nerve, and then they separate out, and then they will basically go to either the adrenals or they'll go to the different digestive organs. So you can see how basically the outflow goes from the spinal cord to the chain ganglia, perhaps to a celiac, or excuse me, perhaps to a collateral ganglion, and then the post will go out to the individual visceral organs, where you have a connection and a synapse with all the major parts of the body, especially the parts of the organs that are involved in the different systems. Now, the parasympathetic axons will infiltrate organs in kind of a similar way, with a couple of nuances, because they don't have that chain ganglia, right? So what they're going to use is a lot of cranial nerves. For instance, the oculomotor will basically pass through what's called the ciliary ganglion. So it's got its own ganglia that it moves through, and that controls the ciliary muscles and the iris of the eye. The facial cranial nerve, or the facial nerve, will basically go through what's called the pterygopalatine ganglion and the submandibular ganglion, which basically says what it is below the mandible, right? This is controlling your lacrimal glands, your tear ducts, your tear producers, your mucosal glands that produce mucus, your nasal cavity, your palate, salivary glands, things like that. Those are connected to those areas. So they have their own group of ganglia that they work through. Your glossopharyngeal, which is number 9, goes through what's called the otic ganglion, and this is in control of your parotid salivary gland, so another salivary gland. Your vagus nerve is an important one. This is the biggie, right? This is the grand poobah of all of your cranial nerves, because it's in control of all those core visceral systems. This one passes through the thoracic nerve plexus. So it's kind of like a little network of nerves, and it goes through that, and it's controlling your heart, your lungs, your esophagus, things like that. So it'll pass through the abdominal pelvic plexus a little further down, and this is going to be in control of your stomach, gallbladder, bile ducts, things like that. And then you have a splanchnic or pelvic splanchnic nerves will pass through these nerve plexuses, which will control your colon, urinary, and your lower abdominal pelvic system. So this is kind of what it looks like. So remember, the dark solid red lines are your preganglionic neurons. So this is basically what we're talking about when we're talking about these long preganglionic neurons, and the postganglionic neurons are inside the tissue itself. So in the case of the first ones that we just talked about, for instance, here is your oculomotor. It's going through the ciliary ganglion, and then the postganglionic will go to the eye. And then 7 will go through the pterygopalatine or the submandibular, and that'll control your salivary glands and your lacrimal gland. And then number 9 will go through the otic ganglion, which will then control the parotid salivaries. And then 10, this is the vagus one, right? This is the one that goes to all of the so-forth systems. So you can see how this vagus basically has a branch off to all the major organs in your major organ systems. And so this basically passes through and innervates. Notice it's solid. It's solid all the way through. The postganglionic tends to be very, very short and oftentimes is inside the organ tissue itself. So sometimes you don't even see the postganglionic neuron. It's so good. And then, of course, your pelvic splanchnic is basically in control of your urinary system and your genitalia. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the sensory. So ultimately, your sensory neurons will be running within the ANS nerves and the plexuses. So you're bringing in sensory information. Vagus, for instance, is bringing in as much sensory information from the periphery of your body as it sends out. Same thing with glossopharyngeal. And so this kind of forms some of those reflex arcs, which is essentially controlling those autonomic or involuntary organ activities. And it's constantly bringing in information from these systems, and it's sending that information back out. And so ultimately, we always think about things like pain and pressure, sensations that are coming from the organs to the central nervous system. But in reality, this sort of duality, this sort of two-way system of sensory information coming in from the nerve and motor going out is basically allowing you to sort of send out motor responses. Say, for instance, something like the vagus. As you're getting information, say, for instance, from the stomach, where you're distending your stomach, then sensory information will come from your stomach, and it'll basically communicate through your vagus nerve to basically kind of stop eating so that you can digest, right? Because this bigger point, your stomach's already full, the stretch receptors are stretching. And so you're basically collecting that information with the same nerve that you send out the response to that information. And so that's the reason why a lot of times these nerves are mixed in nature, mixed sensory and motors, because your sensory route is also going to be handled by the same nerve as your motor route. So the enteric nervous system, so we talked a little bit about sympathetic, we talked about autonomic, and now we're going to talk about enteric. Enteric basically is a series of, it's a nerve plexus. Basically, there's actually 2 major nerve plexuses in the enteric nervous system. And you're going to find them in the wall of your digestive system. As a matter of fact, they're going to be in the wall of the stomach. And so here you're going to have sensory neurons, which basically are connected to the central nervous system. And then the motor neurons will then connect from the autonomic system to the digestive tract. So you have a 2-way connection from the digestive tract to the central nervous system, and then from the central nervous system to the digestive tract. Now, the neurons associated with the enteric nervous system are largely confined to what's called the enteric plexuses. And you have 2 of them, and what they do is they will monitor the digestive tract, and they control the muscle contraction in your stomach in particular. right? And so these will basically control these local reflexes of stomach contraction and also some of the glandular secretions associated with digestion. So the thing you want to remember is the enteric nervous system is basically a subdivision of the parasympathetic. So basically what happens is the vagus nerve delegates the digestive activity to the enteric nervous system. There's so much regulation going on in your digestion that the vagus nerve just basically says, listen, enteric nervous system, enteric plexus, why don't you guys just basically control all things digestive and just report back to me, right? So you just completely take ownership and autonomy of the digestive system, because I've got like cardiovascular system and respiratory system and urinary system to work with. So I got a lot of other major visceral systems to deal with. So why don't you just take over the digestive system and just report back to me? And that's kind of what we mean by it's a subdivision of parasympathetic. It's a completely wholly delegated activity that's overseen basically and reports to the vagus nerve. So what kind of neurons do you see in the enteric nervous system? Well, obviously you're going to have to see some sensory neurons, right? Because you have to be able to know what's going on there. Changes that are happening in the digestive system, for instance, chemical composition that's occurring in there. You have to be able to sense that, what's going on there. The amount of stretch, like especially of your stomach wall, right? So that you have to be able to sense that, because you don't want to overstretch your digestive system. You can basically pop it. And then, of course, you have motor neurons in there as well, so that you can basically either turn on or turn off that smooth muscle contraction and also glandular secretion. So basically, you have to control all of these movements and secretions, and you do that with your motor neurons. And at the same time, you have to sense the circumstances so that you know how and when to purposefully stimulate or inhibit these smooth muscles. And then, of course, you have interneurons, which will basically be connecting both sensory and motor neurons to each other in sort of a reflexive sort of a way. So this is a good place to stop and a good place to start next time, because we're going to continue talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic pretty much throughout the remainder of the chapter.